So yeah, welcome everybody. I would like to thank you very much for joining us today at the launch of this new report on the access to disaster risk financing for frontline actors. This has been a very special initiative for GNDR as it has sought to respond to our members' calls for solutions to the major challenges involved in securing funding for disaster risk reduction at a local level. We all know that disaster risk is increasingly complex and systemic. Hazards can trigger each other with cascading and compounding impacts within and across sectors and geographies, and as well at the local, national, regional, and global levels. So we all know that disaster risk financing activities can help prevent the creation of new disaster risks and mitigate existing ones before they manifest as shocks. However, we all know as well that a significant gap persists in disaster risk reduction financing. We know that not enough at-risk communities have access to finance to be able to respond quickly, recover from the impacts in the event of disaster, and of course, mitigate the disaster risk. GNDR is committed, as you know, to localizing disaster risk financing, enabling faster and more predictable responses by ensuring funds are available for local actors when needed, supporting proactive planning and early actions to minimize disaster impacts. This research supports the development of a roadmap and advocacy plan to bring change to the financing structure so local communities and civil society can better access disaster risk financing. We do hope this report will further spur the disaster risk reduction community to bring a paradigm shift, push for policy change, and guide donors and financial institutions in addressing the gaps and challenges in the localization of disaster risk financing. Finally, before I finish, I will also like to thank very much the Center for Disaster Protection for placing its trust in GNDR and its members to ask the right questions and above all, for contributing its past experience in this area. On a personal note, I would also like to thank Chris, Eloise, and Blossom for all the support you have given us. We only have an hour, as I said before, but we wanted the focus of this presentation to be on the representatives from the communities on the front line. So you will hear from Grace from South Sudan and Khaled from Bangladesh, who will share their own experiences and valuable insights. Later on, we'll have time for a brief discussion, which I truly hope will be constructive and enriching for everyone. Anyway, thank you very much once again. And I'll now hand over to Chris Kegel from the Center for Disaster Protection, who will introduce you to the importance of prearranged finance and local perspectives. So thank you so much again. And Blossom, sorry, and Chris, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. That was a stellar introduction. And thank you everyone again for joining us today. We're very excited that you joined us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Blossom Igbide, and I am the Policy Engagement Officer with the Center for Disaster Protection. Again, really excited to be here and to speak to all of you. I just want to take a moment to briefly reflect on why the Center partnered with GNDR on this research and why local perspectives are so important for the future of disaster risk financing. So at the center, we work to improve how the world plans and pays for disasters so that financing reaches people faster, more effectively, and before crisis escalates. Our focus is prearranged disaster risk financing, and that is financing that delivers protection for especially vulnerable communities so that government actors are better prepared to respond when disaster strikes. But while prearranged financing has enormous potential, we also recognize that the important question it always surfaces of who gets to shape these systems. And too often we find that the organizations closest to disasters are the least involved in decisions about how finance is designed and delivered. And if we want financing systems to work better, we need to understand the experiences of those responding on the front lines. And that's why this partnership with GNDR was particularly very valuable because GNDR has a network of more than 2,000 local organizations across 130 countries. And this gave us a unique opportunity to hear directly from frontline responders. We wanted to understand their lived experience, how they access financing, and also the barriers that they face as well. But also, just as importantly, we wanted our approach to reflect the principles of localization, which the reports is projecting. Rather than speaking about local actors, we wanted to learn from them. And partnering with GNDR enabled us rather to center voices that are too often missing from global policy discussions and conversation, and ensure that their experiences shape the evidence from the outset. The findings, as you'll hear today, show that many frontline organizations continue to face significant barriers, and this reinforces why this conversation is particularly important. So finally, beyond producing a report, we want these insights to shape our own work and also yours as well, to inform conversations with governments, donors, funders, and international partners, so that the experiences of frontline organizations help drive meaningful change in disaster risk financing and how financing is designed. Thank you so much for making the time again to join us today. I will now hand over to Shivangi from GNDR to present the report's findings.
Right. Thank you, Blossom, and thank you for setting the tone for the key findings of the report. I'll request Denny if you could please. Right. So good morning again, good afternoon, good evening. I'm here to present the snapshot of the global survey that Blossom alluded on earlier, that was carried out earlier this year to get the insights from GNDR members on access to disaster risk financing for frontline local actors. Next, please. So before we delve into the insights, a brief context, of course, that was also mentioned that GNDR partnered with the Center for Disaster Protection to initiate this global survey to understand better the way that funding reaches to those on the front line of managing and responding to disaster risk. This joint localizing disaster risk financing initiative centers the voices of local CSOs and at-risk communities, generating evidence and recommendations to strengthen access to finance for locally led management of disaster risk. It also examines how and to what extent local and national actors have access to disaster risk financing. What are those barriers? What are those challenges? And what are those potential enablers which are more predictable and which would make the anticipatory action or locally led actions more effective. Of course, these findings are strongly aligning with the Sendai framework priorities, particularly priority 3, which looks into investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, but also priority 4, which is about enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response. Next, please. So just a summary of where we are getting these inputs from. So we had 330 organizations across 70 countries who had participated in the survey. And if you see, 208 national and local non-governmental organizations participated, Primarily, they are the members of GNDR, but also 36 grassroots organizations also participated in surveys and 65 civil society organizations. So this was a very enriching input that we got at the global level, and we are trying to summarize. We have tried to summarize the insights that we have got from this 330 organizations across 71 countries. Next, please. So the survey findings are primarily divided into 5 broad aspects. A, the organization's involvement in the disaster risk management activities. Second, the awareness itself of pre-arranged finance mechanisms and strategies at the local level. Predictability and the speed of current funding for disaster response work. What is the relationship with the funders, be it government or international organizations, and also the accessibility to such finances. Next, please. Next. So we'll start with the first one, which is organizations' involvement with DRM activities. And we were trying to find out what is the depth and scope of DRM engagement. So we found that the disaster risk engagement has been fragmented, and therefore you find very siloed approach. We only found 16.4% organization actually working in throughout the DRM cycle. The others were either doing humanitarian or development or advocacy work. So very few organizations are working on entire DRM cycle, which speaks about limiting sometimes the effectiveness to have a very integrated approach at the local level. We also found that the fragility and gender gaps had a strong focus on, so conflict affected areas, primarily conflict affected areas had a strong focus on capacity building and climate change adaptation. Although gender is widely mainstream, but it is still unevenly translated into full DRM cycle. So we are doing again a very symptomatic kind of approach towards these issues, be it conflict or gender. Next, please. And continuing with that, we were also trying to find out what are the current sources of disaster risk financing. It's externally driven and imbalanced. We all know about this. We have been talking about this, that international NGOs dominate funding, followed by UN agencies and foundations, while national or local governments and local funding mechanisms remain very, very weak, especially in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. This is also to do with the kind of governance mechanisms that we have at the local level, which might limit the availability of the funding. And the next parameter was about the funding priorities, which are still misaligned with the needs. So investment focuses mostly on capacity building or climate change adaptation or policy advocacy work, while critical areas like anticipatory actions, preparedness, and recovery remain consistently underfunded. So this was one of our findings. Next, please. So the second aspect of it was the awareness of prearranged finance, and we were trying to find out what is that awareness of prearranged finance amongst the local civil society organizations, and most of the countries who participated in the survey say that they were dependent on disaster risk funding strategies, contingency funds, and budgets. But while some of those advanced instruments that we are talking about for prearranged financing, like contingent credits or risk transfer mechanisms, they remained underutilized, or many of them did not have any information about that or any awareness about that. Access is also uneven and insufficient in high-risk contexts. So government-backed insurance is very weak, with limited uptake beyond agriculture and in some areas about the livestock. And the regions such as small island states and fragile contexts have minimal access, leading to continued reliance on the external sources of funding, that too post-disaster funding. Next, please. The local actors' involvement in in pre-arranged finances, their role is quite limited currently to consultations with minimal involvement in designing, targeting, or financial decision making within pre-arranged finances. So they are engaged, but they lack influence. At the same time, the access and power remain highly concentrated only with some few actors. Many organizations are excluded altogether, and existing local technical capacities are underutilized despite their proven potential. Next, please. The direct use of pre-arranged finance by local actors, most of them engage indirectly, despite demonstrating strong capacities. They are dependent on intermediaries to implement, say, anticipatory actions through triggers, contingency planning, or early warning linked responses at community level. So their access is quite limited. They are not formally recognized to use these funds directly. Local mechanisms are more effective, but systems still remain very, very disconnected. Locally driven financing enables faster and more flexible action, we all know. Yet national and global pre-arranged finance systems remain very, very slow, inflexible, and intermediary driven, as I mentioned before, constraining localization. So only 25% have direct access to pre-arranged financing. Next, please. In terms of how these local actors perceive value of pre-arranged fund, one of them is definitely the speed in which if the pre-arranged financing mechanisms are available, especially in fragile contexts, they are timely, they are faster, and they can help to reduce the impact on lives and livelihoods of the people. So they primarily kind of avoid the delay in actions. But we also, they also strongly felt that pre-arranged finance strengthens localization and frontline action. It supports and enhances the collaboration and engagement of the local actors for more context-specific responses, community-led responses, particularly where the local organizations are the first responders. So that kind of makes it more effective. And of course, the predictability improves preparedness and continuity. So pre-arranged finance, along with forecasting mechanisms, supports a better contingency planning and sustained operations in high risk and unstable environments. Next, please. In terms of predictability and speed of current disaster responding, access to disaster funding is slow and inadequate. So only 9% of local actors receive funding immediately after a shock, while some of them have, or most of them say that they had to wait for 3 months or more, which definitely would worsen the impacts at the local level. The timely and predictable financing is critical for effective response. Faster, reliable funding enables early action, as I mentioned before. It also supports in better targeting and reduce secondary risk, especially in context of climate and conflict. And the third one is that predictable funding strengthens preparedness and localization. This was partly covered in my earlier point as well. It allows pre-positioning, contingency planning, and more locally led responses, improving overall resilience and effectiveness. Next, please. In terms of the relationships with funders and primarily government and international organizations, the finding was that the CSO government engagement was strong, but it is still inconsistent. While many CSOs collaborate with governments in disaster risk reduction and response planning, gaps in inclusion persist, limiting systematic and equitable partnerships. And while CSOs are essentially the bridging actors, they connect effectively with the communities, with the government, and deliver early actions, early warnings, enable early warning mechanisms to be more effective, while pre-arranged financing definitely then can strengthen this engagement by enabling more structured anticipatory collaboration. So the role of CSOs gets enhanced because of pre-arranged financing. Next, please. In terms of partnerships and intermediated access to PAF, as I said, that there is poor awareness and clarity on pre-arranged financing, how it works, and it also is limited within the partnerships. Also, minimal flow through funding highlights of high disconnect between the institutional mechanisms and frontline access, constraining localization. Most of the local actors are excluded from the pre-arranged finance benefits. There is the strategic dialogue is still not systematic. It is still kind of, happening in a very erratic manner. But of course, there is a clear appetite for the CSOs to engage and co-design the context-relevant anticipatory financing models. Next, please. So the access to direct financing and localization barrier under the fifth head, which was access to finance. We know that the processes are very complex. There are restrictive criteria. There is limited information and very high compliance requirements, which excludes the local CSOs in a very early stage, reinforcing structural inequities in access to this finance. Also, requirements like INGO partnerships, co-funding, short timelines, and rigid reporting frameworks also acts as in a way, it acts as an advantage for the larger organization and disadvantage for the local organizations or smaller organizations or community-based actors. Local actors call for predictable multi-year and simplified funding with pre-arranged financing, which is seen as a key solution to improve access, timeliness, and equity. And that definitely means that we have a strong demand, or the local actors have strong demand for the structural reforms. Next, please. And then, of course, the current scenario that we all are facing in terms of aid cards, most organizations are already affected with the aid cards, with local CSOs who are the most vulnerable due to reliance on external funding. Organizations are highly concerned that the funding cuts will undermine the ability to prepare for, respond to, and reduce disaster risk. So there's an aspect of sustainability there which is being challenged. And of course, the clear mismatch between the value and funding flows. So despite being more cost-effective and impactful, local CSOs remain the most exposed to the funding cuts, highlighting the structural misalignment in the financing systems. Next, please. So these are some policy and programming reforms, and I'll just kind of skim through that. The key reforms that we have suggested is that there should be a partnerships of intent and not of experience. So findings show that the local actors are limited to very soft roles like community engagement or consultation, but very rarely are seen in the designing process or targeting process or even managing the finances. So to be more effective, local and national CSOs must play a very meaningful role in the governance of pre-arranged financing. So we have also found that the fragmented funding and siloed programs disrupt continuity across disaster cycle, creating that gaps and duplications. Policy makers and funders should use pre-arranged finance to enable proactive end-to-end local DRM from risk reduction to recovery. So kind of completely looking at the cycle rather than looking at a very siloed approach in that sense. Next, please. Capacity building, whether there is gap or a trap. So systemic access barriers, not capacity gaps, are the main constraint for local actors. So it is about the access barriers. Is not about capacity every time. And despite the local actors, they have proven their capabilities. So while tailored capacity support has value, it must not replace or delay any genuine access funding and delivery rules. Over 80% of the respondents who had worked in the fragile context, where local CSOs are often the only actors to be able to respond, we need to focus more. We need to kind of give that access of prearranged financing to those actors, because they would require to reach out to the most vulnerable population and cater to them in the most meaningful way. Next, please. So prearranged finance is a two-way conversation. It should shift power dynamics by embedding CSOs at a very early stage through stronger coordination, through clear rules and meaningful participation in decision-making with the government and funders. We are not shifting the risk. We are trying to share the risk through the prearranged financing mechanisms. So the compliance processes should be little less stringent. We need to reinforce risk perception from the lens of the local actors. The local actors are the one who knows what kind of context that they are working in, and I think there is also some element of trust which is required. So we need to do away with this complex compliance processes. More with less. We know that aid cuts is a reality. We need to make our responses more cost effective, and for that prearranged finance is the key, which will give them to kind of stretch the resources and advance localization and reach out to the communities. Next. Yeah. So with this, I end my my presentation, and I'm sure you will have link today or while we are launching this report, and I hope that helps everybody to shape their strategies and policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shivangi. That was really a really insightful presentation, as it is the report. Now, thanks to Chris, we would like to have a bit of a discussion, and also bring, as I said at the beginning, the perspective of some of our members in South Sudan and Bangladesh. Chris, please.
Thanks, Marcos, and hi everyone. And yeah, at this point, I'd really like just to invite. We've got two GNDR members who've kindly agreed to join us today and provide their perspectives and thoughts on this report, on the work that it involves, and on why this matters. And I'd really just like to invite each of them in turn to take the mic for a few minutes and just share their thoughts. So if we ask Khaled to speak first of all, and then Grace, and then after that, Arbie has kindly also joined us from FCDO to provide a bit of a response to those perspectives, to the report as a whole, and just a bit of a insight from the FCDO side as to where this perhaps fits in the wider agenda. So I'll ask speakers to introduce themselves briefly, and then over to you. So Khaled, I can see you've come on screen. Let me pass to you, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris, distinguished colleagues, Marcos, and the GNDR and CDP teams. Thank you for launching this landmark global survey report. So as we manage the complex disaster risks in Bangladesh, so this research mirrors the exact challenges we navigate daily on the front lines. When we look at the theme of how local government stipulation impact of support civil society access to localized disaster risks, financing, we are looking at the core operational realities of the localizations. So in Bangladesh, and specifically within the multi-hazard landscape like Cox's Bazar, so which simultaneously grapples with cyclical monsoons, flash flood, landslide, and one of the largest protected humanitarian displacement crises in the world. So interaction with the government is inconstant. So the report correctly highlights that 74% of the CSOs have a strong but inconsistent interaction with public authorities. So the critical bottleneck, however, is that this consultative relationship rarely translates into direct financial access. So in Cox's Bazar, local government stipulation act as a dual-edged sword. On one hand, the government has excellent regulatory frameworks for disaster risk reduction, such as localized disaster management committee at the district and the sub-district levels, which actively includes CSOs as operational and consultative partners. However, the financial stipulations are highly centralized. Local public funds and contingency budgets remains rigidly tied to bureaucratic post-disaster reallocation structures. For a local CSOs like us and others to unlock resources or obtain regulatory approval to deploy funds during a crisis, we must navigate multi-tiered administrative compliance framework. In an environment where only 9% of the local actors globally receive funding immediately after a shock, these lengthy localized approvals stretch the timeline even further, forcing us into reactive posture when we need to be anticipatory. So let me share an example, a concrete example in the Cox's Bazar. Like during very recent monsoon in Cox's Bazar, local CSOs post the localized risk data and the community trust to execute forecast-based evacuation and early actions. So, however, because of the formal arranged financing instruments are not embedded with the municipality or the district public financial management system, local authorities could not legally release contingency funds before the disaster hit. So instead, CSOs had to rely on the strained internal resources or wait weeks of international intermediaries to pass down intermediate funding. This structural disconnect means that even though the local government explicitly relies on CSOs as the essential bridging actors to reach the most vulnerable, the prevailing financial stipulation do not treat CSOs as the financial partners. So, that brings me directly back to be the brilliant recommendation outlined in the GNDR CDP report. Like, first, we must advocate for what the report calls partnerships of intent, not of expedience. So, local government stipulation must include CSOs, not just in soft community consultation, but directly in the governance, design, and financial decision-making of risk triggers and contingency funds. So second, we need risk sharing, not risk shifting. The complex compliance requirements imposed by the international donors, often reinforced by national regulatory bodies, that favors large international organizations and view local CSOs through a lens of high fiduciary risk. So we must use pre-arranged finance as an equity multiplier, simplifying these processes so that local actors in fragile settings like Cox's Bazar can access flexible multi-year funding directly. So as the report concludes, localizing disaster risk funding is no longer a normative aspiration. It is a practical imperative for efficiency and value for money. So if we are to achieve the commitments of the Sendai framework, we must reform our structures so that those who are first to respond are no longer the last to be funded. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you, Khaled. And let me now, if I could, in the interest of time, pass straight on to Grace for her insights. And Grace, please do also introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, Marco, and thank you to GNDR and the Center for Disaster Protection for inviting me to share reflection from South Sudan. I'm Dorong Grace, Executive Director of Root of Generations, a local women-led organization working with communities affected by conflict, displacement, and climate-related disasters in South Sudan. From our experience, localizing disaster risk financing is not simply about moving money closer to the communities. It is about moving decisions, trust, and leadership closer to the people who face risk every day. In South Sudan, disasters do not happen one at a time. A drought reduces water and pasture. Communities move in search of resources. Competition over those resources can trigger conflict. Conflict leads to displacement. Then floods or another climate shock strike communities that are already vulnerable. For local organizations, climate change, conflict, and displacement are not separate issues. They are interconnected realities that require integrated response. Although local organizations are the first to respond, we are often the last to receive financing. Funding remains highly centralized. Decisions are often made far from the communities most affected. Compliance requirements are difficult for many local organizations. Funding is still largely reactive rather than anticipatory. Delays increases operational costs and human suffering. In Eastern Equatoria, by the time funding reaches local organizations, communities may already have lost livestock. Children may have dropped out of school, and families may have been displaced several times. The report confirms this reality by showing that fewer than 1 in 10 organizations receive funding immediately after disasters, despite local actors being on the front line. Local organizations already have community trusts, local expertise, established volunteer networks, women groups, youth groups, traditional leaders, and early warning information systems. Imagine if these local systems have predictable, flexible, and pre-arranged financing before disasters occur. Before drought intensifies, communities could rehabilitate water points, protect livestock, support vulnerable households, and reduce conflict over scarce resources. I therefore strongly agree with the report's finding that pre-arranged financing can improve speed, predictability, and preparedness for local actors. If I may leave one message today, it is this. Local organizations are not asking donors to take greater risks. We are asking donors to recognize the capacity that already exists within communities. Local organizations should not only implement projects after decisions have been made, we should be trusted to participate in designing financing mechanisms, setting priorities, and leading anticipatory actions. I would like to end by supporting one of the report's key recommendations. Localization will only become a reality when resources reach local actors before disasters escalate, not after communities have exhausted their own coping mechanisms. Because the people closest to the risk are also closest to the solutions. At the root of generations, we have seen that investing in local leadership, particularly women, youth, and traditional community structures, not only strengthen disaster preparedness, but also reduce conflict and builds long-term resilience. Thank you.
And thank you. And actually, I was really struck by one of your closing points there, that I think in the report we say those who are closest to risk are often furthest from the finance. And I think that's also true, but you've inverted that with your point that those closest to risk are often also those closest to the solutions, which I think is a critical point for us to remember. So thank you both. If I may now bring in our third speaker, Arbie, you've kindly agreed to provide a little reflection on where this agenda sits from the FCDO side. You've heard our speakers, the headline findings. Where does this land with you? What's your sort of response as to why this matters and where we might go from here? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arbie Baguios. I'm the localization lead at FCDO. And just to start, this issue is close to my own heart. I am originally from the Philippines, where it's one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. And I used to be a local actor employed within a local or a national organization in the Philippines. And so I'm really supportive of this. And I think that this is important work. And hats off to everyone involved for this report. And I'm looking forward to reading the full version of it. Here at FCDO, we recognize that locally led prearranged finance is important for many reasons. Firstly, we have ministerial commitment that we are going to have a new modern partnerships approach where we shift from international intervention to local leadership. And we do this because we recognize that local actors understand risk best. They enable speed, improve targeting and accountability, offer value for money, and anchor disaster risk financing in national systems. FCDO is already supporting locally led DRF in many ways. We're funding DRF platforms such as the Global Risk Financing Program that helps governments access contingent finance, insurance, and early response funding. We invest in early warning and risk information systems that underpin locally relevant triggers and early action. We fund research, policy advice, and learning, and we engage in localization and access to funding throughout the sector, and we fund different organizations who are involved in this. More broadly, FCDO is committed to localization in many ways, but firstly around strengthening national and local systems and making sure that we strengthen that and complement that, especially in fragile and conflict affected states, which I understand most of the respondents of the survey and the members of the network are working in. We also support equitable partnerships. So what really resonated with me is the point around risk sharing, and not shifting risk, but risk sharing, recognizing as well that it's local actors who carry a lot of the risk, usually not just financial or programmatic risk, but security and safety risk, and it's their communities that are affected first when there is a disaster. And we also emphasize quality funding to local actors. We emphasize quality funding to local actors, and we try as much as possible to fund as directly as possible, as international as necessary. Now, of course, I understand that FCDO, we have to do a lot of changes within ourselves to kind of like enable local leadership, which is why they have created my role as localization lead. And maybe I can share with you some of the things we're doing to do this. So as the localization lead, I'm working closely with our posts, our embassies, who are the decision makers in FCDO, because we are a devolved organization, in helping facilitate learning and sharing of best practice across posts on how they can enable locally led humanitarian action, whether that's through funding organizations directly or funding intermediaries and pooled funds where local actors can access these funding. So we are experimenting and learning and innovating, especially at post level on this. And there is a lot to be learned and which can inform wider changes. We're also doing a lot of internal reforms within the FCDO and piloting new ways of working. So, for example, in FCDO, we have this kind of like program and operations framework that's basically the Bible of people working in FCDO on how to implement programs. And in this refresh, we are saying that local actors are not inherently risky, and we're making that a point to recognize that local actors are not inherently risky. And of course, the final strand is external engagement. So being invited to report launches and engagements like this, where we can hear directly from all of you, your experiences is really valuable in helping us understand where we could do better in localization. And perhaps I can end with some reflections on what has been said. I think one point that was made by the report is that the disaster risk management kind of like mechanisms across different countries is widespread but fragmented. In FCDO, we're starting to think about this ecosystem approach, of seeing not just localization and locally led in terms of partnerships, but in terms of wider ecosystem. So a question that comes up to me that I think about hearing all of this is, how do we support a more locally led humanitarian ecosystem where there are various actors working in different stages of DRM? We also know that different actors are required in really advancing locally led prearranged financing and DRM. So I know, for example, in the Philippines, there's recently been a change in law where they've passed the anticipatory action law, and I understand that required different people, right? It's local civil society, yes, and NGOs, international NGOs, but also scientists and meteorologists, also policy people. So it brings this question to me: how do we engage as a sector with this ecosystem of local actors? The second reflection is around transitioning, right? Transitioning to a more locally led prearranged financing. We've heard from the initial sharing of findings that prearranged financing is still concentrated to a few actors. It's very intermediary driven. Only 25% of local civil society have direct access to prearranged financing. So it makes me ask the question, what steps do we need to take to transition this? Realistically and pragmatically, fine, maybe we cannot do it overnight, but what is, let's say, the 3-year vision, the 5-year vision, the 5-year roadmap, so that we can transition this to our more locally led ecosystem? And finally, and I think this was also mentioned by Grace, in FCDO, yes, we care about localization, but ultimately at the heart of what we're trying to do is being people-centered. And that's looking at how do we elevate the voice and the participation in decision-making of marginalized groups, particularly women and girls and other marginalized populations, and the organizations that represent them. So, for example, refugee-led organizations and women-led organizations. I will end by, just echoing something that I heard was really powerful from both Khaled and Grace. Recognizing that local actors are the first to respond, but last to be funded. But as Grace mentioned, they are the people who are closest to the risk are also closest to the solution. So a question for all of us, for FCDO included, is, so then how do we get closer to the people, and how do we support them better so that they can so that we recognize their local leadership in disaster response and disaster management? I will end there. Thank you very much.
It's fantastic. Thank you. And thank you very much for those insights as well. I know it's, and you touched on the fact that this is a challenging time and one that's seeing big changes, but that brings with it opportunities and the chance to force shifts in ways of working as well. And you really helpfully outlined what some of those might look like. I'm going to swap round the order very slightly. So I was going to give a couple of closing comments after Q&A. Let me give my comments now because they may answer some of the questions that have been posted, and I'll try and keep these brief. Let me also just give a quick heads up. So there are 3 questions I'm seeing that haven't been answered yet, that probably won't be by my closing comments. There's an interesting one as we approach the review of the Sendai framework and SDGs. What one recommendation from this report should shape the post-2030 global agenda? And I'll invite in a couple of minutes Marcos or Shivangi to come back on that. Probably one for Shivangi, a slide on trusts and foundations as a primary source of funding. Were there any other findings about the role of philanthropy or perceptions of those donors from local organisations? So the difference between NGOs versus government and philanthropy funding specifically. And then Arbie, one that I'll ask you to come back on very briefly is a question on the nexus approach. So localization principles can only be supported and achieved using the nexus. Does the FCDO have a vision or strategy to support projects using the nexus approach? So let me come back in a minute to Marco Shvangi and Arbie on that. We're short on time, so I'll invite you all to give brief answers. Let me also then very quickly just give a couple of thoughts on what comes next. So we've shared the findings from the report, and we've had some really useful insights into why this matters and how it might fit in the wider sort of political shift. Let me very briefly, and firstly, I should introduce myself, having been talking to you all for the last few minutes. So I'm Chris Kidgell. I'm the Head of Policy Engagement at the Centre for Disaster Protection. So I've been working with the team here and with GNDR very closely on this, and delighted to be launching the report today. And thank you all for your time and for joining us. Let me give you a boiled down version of the three things that I think come next here. So first is the report's recommendations themselves, and some of the questions relate to that and how are you taking this forward. I think the network that GNDR brings together provides a unique and unparalleled set of insights here. So it really is quite unique in its structure and in how we can bring together that range and diversity of voices. As a result, I think we've got some really punchy and actionable recommendations. So in practical terms, both the Centre and GNDR will be looking for opportunities to promote and build on those recommendations in the year ahead. So that's in dialogues, discussions with government, it's in the international policy and event stage. And we will be looking to take these points forward and to land them with decision makers. There is real momentum behind the pre-arranged finance agenda at the moment, but we do need to make sure that that momentum doesn't outpace us and we don't miss the chance to really embed some of these principles in the foundations of what comes next. So that's one point. And to that end, we'd encourage you all to think, what does this mean for how you work and where are the opportunities to bring in some of these perspectives there? Second point from me is that the report launched today draws solely and exclusively on the perspectives of GNDR members. So it's about their priorities, and we have actively resisted broadening that out or imposing any other perspectives or priorities on that. But of course, this does sit in a wider policy space and a wider ecosystem, and we want to engage with that. So as a first step, a couple of months ago, we jointly co-convened a roundtable to dig into some of these issues a bit further with a mix of some of the leading voices and thinkers around pre-arranged finance, disaster risk, localization, and more widely. That surfaced some opportunities, but also some of the sort of challenges, bottlenecks, and frictions around what this looks like in practice. And we want to capture and build on those. So there will be a second brief coming in the near future, next couple of months, bringing out some of those findings. Please do look out for that, and that looks sort of step this on into the next level. And then thirdly and finally, the discussions today are intended to spark further conversation, not resolve issues. We know that we can only take this forward collectively. So we want to be talking to and working with all of you, aligning where the opportunities are there, and finding ways to take this forward together. So I think it's widely accepted that local actors have a critical role to play in disaster response. What that looks like in practice is hard to build financing mechanisms and processes ahead of shocks that intentionally factor in and involve local actors from the offset, not as a bolt-on or afterthought. And I think today's report is a big step forward in that. Let me, on that note, add two very quick reflections on questions. So one is around spend on DRF rather than DRR. So that was the anonymous attendee, the first question. I think yes and no, that actually our finding is that most most spending happens is only delivered after a shock, but isn't arranged or considered beforehand. It's purely reactive. It's slow. It's responsive. Actually, I would absolutely agree that there is a challenge here to integrate DRR and DRF better. All of this is about thinking ahead of shocks and looking to shift the system before rather than after the worst happens. So I think there is a chance to use this work to spark that thinking. And similarly, hopefully some of what you've heard from Arbie and from other speakers to Philemon on how we can start to break down some of these fragmentations answers that. So let me pause there. Marcos, I don't know if you wanted to come back on the SDGs point, Shivangi on philanthropies, and then Arbie on Nexus. And I know we're at time. Appreciate people may have to drop off. Thank you if you do, but if we push on for a couple more minutes, we'll try and address some of those. So Marcos, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, very briefly, and I also would like to thank all the more than 170 participants. Please stay with us just a couple of more minutes. In terms of let me quote Arbie in terms of the future of 20 SDGs or Sendai framework or post 2030. I think this is the transition time. I think that this is the time that we really need to give it a push, both frameworks, SDGs and the Sendai framework, and to make sure that we transition properly to the next stage after 2030. And I think, GNDR has been working hard as part of the stakeholder engagement mechanism at the Sendai framework, representing civil society. The only way of making sure that we can take the next step in introducing on that transition aspects like this one. It's not just about localization like a concept. It is actual localized, for example, prearranged finance. We need to do that together, and we need to make sure that that approach, as Arbie again said, people-centered approach, localized approach, is a key relevant part of the conversation. Again, it's a call to action to all of us to get involved and take advantage of this transition period and make sure that we can bring something better for the next global frameworks and something more localized, something more people-centered.
Thanks, Marcos. Shivangi, did you have anything you wanted to share on the philanthropies question or any insights that we got there?
Thanks, Chris. I think primarily we were trying to understand from the survey that what are the sources of pre-arranged financing, and some of the local actors did mention the role of philanthropy or trust or foundations who would provide them with the pre-arranged financing. But the only finding here was that it was not for disaster risk reduction or the complete cycle of DRM. It was more in terms of disaster response. So again, very limited, but yes, again, the challenge of the compliance, the challenge of the timeliness of availing those funds were cited as one of the barriers. So yeah, so that's in brief my response, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Arbie, just on the Nexus question, any thoughts, reflections on that?
No, thanks for the question. And yeah, very briefly, FCDO recognizes the importance of working across, having the Nexus approach working across development and humanitarian sectors in order to advance local leadership, not just in humanitarian action, but in development as well. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Look, I know we've have far more questions than we can answer directly. I hope some of the wider conversation has helped to give a sense of where we see the opportunities here, and the fact that this is an ongoing piece of work. There are things to push forward on. This isn't a done deal. Thank you all for joining us. Marcos, let me hand back to you just to close us out and send everyone on their way. Thank you.
Again, nothing much to say. Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you so much, Khaled, and of course, Arbie, and for being here. Thank you so much, Chris, Blossom, Eloise, and the whole CDP team. Again, this is a joint effort, and I think that this report is an example of that joint effort. As I said before, this is a time for us to get together and to work together on socializing the fundings, because we do believe that this is going to help in transitioning to a more localized financing for disaster risk reduction. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. It's been a pleasure. In our website is already published the report in English, and hopefully in a couple of days we will have that report in French and Spanish. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.